Yeah, that's the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and Einstein was there. We were in a different location. We were at the Applied Physics Laboratory, which is halfway between Baltimore and Washington. Top secret. They do a lot of weapons, space exploration, but other things, including they have what they call the Warfare Analysis Laboratory, the Walrus, and that's where we did the war game. Yes, we had this crew, and I got a couple of Wall Streeters in there. So before I went down there, I had dinner in Darien, Connecticut, where I lived at the time, with the one fellow who was the Russian expert. And I said, Steve, here's what we're going to do. Steve Hallowell was his name. I said, you're on the Russian team. I'm on the China team. When we take our first break and we go to our embassies and whatever to come up with our plans, we should both push our team members to go back, for those countries to go back to a gold standard. The idea was Russia and China would jointly announce that from now on, if you wanted to buy Russian energy or Chinese manufactured goods, you can only pay for it in a new currency that they had created. They were going to set up a bank in London, issue a new currency, etc. But it was 100% backed by gold. And if you wanted this currency, you could either deposit gold in the bank, which is fine, which they did, or you could run a trade surplus and get some other currency or borrow it. But the dollar was done. They weren't going to take dollars anymore. Now, obviously, this is not the kind of thing that happens overnight. It's forward-leaning. But that's the whole idea of a war game, is to lean 5 or 10 years forward and tell people what's going to happen. And so my Chinese partners, including one guy who went on the National Security Council for Obama, rejected the idea, but the Russian team went for it. And then it was funny, they have referees, and when we first did it, announced it, the referee said, you can't do that, you're breaking the rules or whatever. And I stood up and said, wait a second, it's a war. There are no rules, you can do whatever you want. And they finally agreed. They said, well, it's a legal move, but it's a dumb move. I said, well, we'll see how it plays out. And after 3 days, Russia had gained points, China had gained points. Just a quick footnote, Steve, when we did this, Russia and China each had about 600 metric tons of gold. That was their reserve position. Today, Russia has 3,000 metric tons. China admits to 2,000 metric tons, actually a little closer to 3,000 metric tons, although there's good reason to believe that they have maybe 5,000 metric tons or more, behind the curtain. It's something called the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. Either way, both countries have quadrupled or more, five times, 500% increase in their gold reserves, which is exactly what we told the Pentagon was going to happen in 2008. They hosted the war game. They got the results. Secretary Gates said, hey, nice job, everybody. We warned them about it in 2008, but I've warned them many times since. I got to say, I do get the meetings, whether it's the Treasury or the Fed or the White House or the Pentagon. I get in the door. I get to meet with the people I want to meet with. They're very polite. They listen to me. It's all good. But they don't do anything. I was in another war game. They have what they call tabletop war games, which are, 10 or 15 people sit around a table. It's less elaborate than what we did at the Applied Physics Laboratory. But I was, kind of basically saying what I'm saying now, that this is the de-dollarization. And my particular point at that time, this a few years later, was that we were overusing the sanctions. Economic sanctions are powerful. They can work in certain cases, not all, but some cases. But over time, you are going to force people to get away from the dollar. It's like, how many times can you hit a punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? And that's what the BRICS are doing. They're walking out of the room. And that has accelerated. But so anyway, I'm in this meeting, and I'm one seat away from this guy, David Dollar, who was a senior official at the U.S. Treasury and partly in charge of foreign currency and relations with Asia. And so I'm kind of talking along the lines I'm talking right now. And Dollar's interesting name. His name is Dollar. But David says, the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. It always has been the global reserve currency, and it always will be the global reserve currency. And he slammed, both hands, palm down on the table. I said, David, I feel like I'm sitting in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull say, sterling is the global reserve currency and it always will be the global reserve currency. Of course, that's not true. Sterling was done by 1944 by Bretton Woods. So again, these things don't happen overnight. They happen slowly. It's like a salami type of push, but it is happening. And this is where the Ukraine war comes in. You're absolutely correct. In fact, I can tell you the month that the decline of sterling began as a global reserve currency. It was November 1914. Because you're right, guns of August, the war started, end of July, beginning of August 1914. Now, initially, what was happening was that the UK and other European powers, but were selling assets in the US. They were selling stocks, selling whatever they could to get gold, because you were in a gold standard at the time, and they knew they would need the gold to fight the war. And believe it or not, John Maynard Keynes, who got this reputation as a gold basher, it's not true. He was the guy. He was the one voice in the Exchequer in the UK at that time saying, you must remain on the gold standard. And his insight was the following. He said, 20 million dead. I mean, the human sacrifice is beyond imagination. But he said, we're not going to win the war with gold. We're not going to win the war with money. We're going to win the war with credit. Your ability to borrow is going to determine your ability to win the war. And by staying on the gold standard, they had the credit. And Jack Morgan, because the U.S. was neutral at the time, we didn't get until 1917. Jack Morgan raised hundreds of millions of dollars for France and the UK. He did not raise one penny for Germany, not a penny. And he could have, because again, we were neutral. And of course, the UK won the war. But what happened in November was, after getting all the gold in from selling assets, they needed stuff. Agriculture, clothing, weapons, gunpowder, resources, metals. They needed stuff, and they had to buy it from the United States. So the gold started to go back to the United States to pay for all this stuff, and that flow reversed in November 1914. But it took 30 years. It wasn't until July 1944, when they signed Bretton Woods, that sterling was done, and the U.S. dollar and the gold standard were the global standard. But that's how it happens. It happens over time. You're right. It was two wars: World War I, World War II, and a lot else besides, and massive debt, and over-relying on the Commonwealth country. Today, and I've said this frequently, the world cannot destroy the U.S. dollar, but we can do it ourselves. The United States can destroy the U.S. dollar, and that's exactly what we're doing. And Ukraine is a big part of it because of all these sanctions. Again, I teach financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College down in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. My class, they're handpicked mid-career, like lieutenant colonels, Navy commanders. I had the Top Gun ones, pilot from the Navy in my class. Small group, about 12 or so, and some civilians, CIA, State Department, etc. And so I taught the class in the spring of 2022. Right after the war in Ukraine started. And I said, here's what's going to happen. The U.S. had thrown every sanction you could think of, freezing the assets of the Russian central bank, banning exports of oil, on and on and on. And I said, the Russian economy is going to do just fine. Any oil that Europe doesn't buy, they're going to sell to China and India. They're going to ramp up, they're going to put their economy in a war footing, ramp up their industrial base, etc. The sanctions will mean almost nothing to them. And I got a lot of skepticism, a lot of pushback, because they were all gung-ho, it was right after the war started. I taught the class again in the spring of 2023. I said, here's what I told the class last year, and every single thing I said was right. It's exactly what's happening. The ruble's strong. The Russian economy, they have labor shortages. I mean, their economy is expanding faster than the U.S. economy. Their economic problems, they have labor shortages because they're growing so quickly. They don't need to import all these weapons. They're building themselves. By the way, what this war has shown is that NATO, Poland, forget it, they couldn't defend France at this point. I mean, these Kinzhal missiles, these hypersonic missiles, they're blowing up the Patriots. They've blown up 4 Patriot missile batteries, $1 billion each. And they've blown up 4 of them with these hypersonic missiles, etc. So Russia's doing just fine. But meanwhile, they've expanded the BRICS. They're moving full speed ahead with the currency. And by the way, China's a big part of it economically, but the big brains are in Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the finance minister, Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, Putin himself. I mean, Putin's 2 favorite sports are martial arts and chess. So it kind of tells you that he's a very skilled player.